Welcome to this episode of Fast Keto, you guys. Today, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Angela Stanton joining us on the podcast, and she is an expert when it comes to electrolytes. So I was thrilled to get to have her on the show. She's written a couple of books about migraines and electrolytes, and she is writing a new one now for carnivores and people who do keto as well. So we had a full-on discussion today all about sodium, potassium, water, hydration, every question that you would want to know about all of these electrolyte questions that we have. And she shared so much incredible, valuable information. It was just an honor to have her on the show today, and she's just an incredibly knowledgeable person. So I know you guys are going to get a ton out of this episode, and I would love to hear what your takeaways were. Head over to Instagram, Twitter, share them with us and what you liked, and also here on YouTube, drop a comment and share the episode with someone that you think would benefit from learning more about electrolyte balance and sodium from a true expert. Good morning, Dr. Stanton. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Fast Keto podcast. I'm thrilled to have you here with us.
Good morning, Vanessa. Please call me Angela. Really humbled to be with you. Thank you for the interview.
That's wonderful. Well, for anyone who is listening in and hasn't come across your work yet, I would love if you could just give us a little bit of background of how you came to be in this keto carnivore space a little bit.
Okay, so that was a very unusual situation, I think, or maybe not so for everyone. I'm a migrainer, so a migraine sufferer all my life. And as I got older, it became worse and worse and worse, in spite of what everybody always said that it was going to get better as you get older. It actually got worse. And so I quit my job. I was teaching at a university. I was working as a research scientist at Max Planck University in Germany. I quit everything to sort of figure out what migraine was all about and how to stop it. And in the process of discovering what migraine was, I discovered how important electrolytes were. And so I started to focus on electrolytes and change my diet. Didn't start with keto first, started first with low carb, high fat, as most everybody I'm sure does. And then slowly, totally accidentally actually, got into ketosis. And I said, I really like this. But I didn't quite do it the right way the first time because electrolytes were kind of interfering. I didn't have the right electrolytes at the time, particularly for a migrainer, which requires a little bit different electrolyte combination than a person who doesn't have electrolytes. So it's been over 10 years of work trying to understand, reading all the literature, always totally focusing on migraine. But the outcome of that was the understanding of electrolytes and nutrition. So that's how I came to it all.
That's wonderful. I mean, it is endlessly fascinating to me to understand how our bodies regulate electrolytes. I mean, my favorite organ in the body is the kidneys and the nephron. It is the most beautiful, sophisticated organ. I mean, there are no words when you look at its sophistication, and the way it manages our electrolytes is endlessly fascinating to me anyhow. It sounds like to you as well.
It is. And if you consider what the kidneys are, they are probably the oldest organs. If you go back in the animal kingdom to see how many animals, in terms of going down the ladder of complexity, they still have kidneys. So I don't know exactly at what point animals stop having kidneys, but they all have electrolytes in some way or another. They have to modulate, even a bacteria has to modulate its fluid. So there is some system in every organism. So this is probably the key to the basics of life, if you look at it that way.
That's amazing. I mean, it's such an exquisitely designed organ.
It's very complex. And kidneys as a food, it's really complex. Just to take it apart, it's a very complicated organ. Yes.
Let's start with the basics. I think some people have familiarity that we have a sodium and potassium, balance in the body, and that our cells, some people are familiar with the fact that we have a sodium potassium pump on our cells, right. And that's what regulates that flow. Is that flow of in and out is constantly happening at the cellular level. So it really is a part of every single function, almost, if you think of our cells from that really nano, micro level.
It is part of every single cell, basically. Without it, the cells don't survive. So there may be what we would call the RAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, that operates it from deep down within the kidneys of how the electrolyte is functioning. But at the cellular level, every single cell is operating its own electrolyte system based on a sodium-potassium pump. Now, there are other areas where sodium and potassium gets into the cell and gets out of the cell, but the basic area that we are looking at is a sodium-potassium pump, because that is the one that operates basically the electrical functions that operate the cells, particularly the central nervous system. So in terms of migraine, I found that to be the much more important place to look at than other places like on the skin or elsewhere. I mean, we still have the same idea, but I didn't spend much time on that because that was a little bit distant from what I was looking at in terms of migraine. But the sodium potassium pump is the most important electrolyte area, I should say, where everything is happening for the cell. But for the kidneys, it is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So the two separate systems basically that manipulate what's happening to sodium and potassium in the body.
I think that's probably why it's been so complex, is that, like you said, it's these two different systems that are working, and yet they're also, because they're both in our body, they're interrelated. And so you have so many different opinions, on, for example, in the carnivore space, and I definitely want to get to migraines, because I know there are a lot of people out there who are looking for information on that too. But in the sort of the keto and carnivore space, what I have found to be the most research-backed information is some research provided by Finney and Volek, where they showed that the government guidelines, the recommended amount of sodium intake, and just speaking of sodium, is that about half of what the number that's associated with the lowest mortality is. So I think it's about 2 point something grams, and it's actually closer to 5 that's associated with lowest mortality. And even if you double that, you still don't even get close to the government guideline number. So there's a lot of debate in the keto and carnivore space. In keto, less. In keto, it seems to be understood that you need to supplement and add electrolytes, because when you lower insulin, then the kidneys don't reabsorb as much sodium in the distal tubule, so they release more of it.
Right.
But there's also this counteraction of, if you don't have enough sodium, then you can actually increase insulin resistance because you're not getting enough. So it seems like in keto that's well established that you need to take sodium, but in the carnivore space it's debated constantly because there are long-term carnivores who don't add sodium at all and they don't have issues, and then there seem to be all kinds of issues. I've seen the main one that I see is people getting up in the night to go and urinate, and there just seems to be a lot of confusion. So I've been interviewing a lot of doctors and specialists on it, but I'm curious as to what your take is on all that.
Right. Excuse me. It is a very confusing space. So let me back up a little bit and talk about where the RAS system gets in here, which everybody seems to have forgotten. So it's a very important system. So if you reduce your sodium, and this is why the Finney and Volek study that you referred to is actually going back to a paper that I think was published in Lancet or the British Medical Journal, I forget which. Both of them had a lot of papers on this, where they actually showed a study where there were 100,000+ participants, and they looked at the data, and they were the ones who came up with an unusual U-curve, where it showed that if you're taking, I believe it was less than 500 or 600 milligrams sodium, then your total mortality rate actually sharply increased. It was an exponential increase. And then the ideal sodium, if I remember, was between 4,500 and 6,000 milligrams sodium for all people, including those with heart disease. They were looking at cardiovascular disease, stroke, those with or without statin, so a whole kind of combination, and diabetes. And then on the other spectrum, on the right side, the U curve was kind of sort of flat and long and long and long, and it went to 8,000 milligrams sodium. And actually, if you looked at the paper, it went all the way to 12,000 milligrams sodium, and they have a curve around it for the plus and minus so that you could see the spread. There were people whose health was improving past the 12,000 milligrams sodium. And we're talking, we have to specifically say that it's not salt we're talking about, but just sodium. So that sodium is 40% of salt. So you could see that there's a huge spectrum, but clearly anything that was below, that already at the level of where the USDA recommends, and at that time it was 2,400 milligram, now it's 2,300. So it's lowering. Now we are entering the zone, and if you go down to the level of USD, you actually increase your mortality. So it clearly isn't healthy. But in terms of when we eat sodium, and so assume we don't have a guideline. Assume that we just look at, okay, I want to eat salt. How much salt should you eat? So it's very easy to evaluate how much salt you need, how much sodium you need. And you refer to your urination at night. So the RAS system maintains your electrolyte balance. So what does that mean? It means that if sodium or potassium, these are the two main electrolytes, you're not really looking at the others, magnesium, calcium, and so forth. They don't participate that much in this. If you increase either the sodium or the potassium, the RAS system of your kidneys will dump the extra. So you can't really overdose your sodium and potassium. I'm talking about healthy people now, not the ones with insulin resistance or cardiovascular disease. So if you're healthy, then your kidneys work really good. And if you ate too much sodium, well, what's going to happen is you're going to get up and start urinating because your RAS system is just simply going to remove the excess with the extra water. So you're dehydrating yourself. It doesn't matter if you take extra sodium or extra potassium. They both do the same because the RAS system's function is to reset the balance to what it is, the proper osmolality, which is the density of the electrolytes in the water. And so you can't really overdo it for this reason. Now, if you're sick and if you have insulin resistance, or if you have heart disease, or you have other atherosclerosis, specifically where your arteries are narrower than normal and they're inflamed, there may be a little bit of a change there because it's not just the kidneys then anymore, but it's also the flow of your blood, right? So we cannot separate the electrolytes really from the blood. So everything is in the blood as it flows together. So when you increase sodium, you also increase water. It retains water. It pulls more water into your blood vessels. So it actually causes excess hydration, so you increase your blood volume. If you have healthy vascular system, then your blood vessels are just going to expand and let that be, and you're fine. And it waits until your kidneys empty everything. But if your health is not good, then your blood vessels, particularly if they're inflamed and have atherosclerosis, with calcium plaque or not, because there's also a debate about that. It doesn't matter which way. If you have too much, your walls become a little bit less flexible, or if it's calcified, it's completely brittle, right? And then if they can't expand, so then the blood volume makes a big difference, and that is when you may find yourself with increased blood pressure. But in my group of migraineurs, currently about 7,000 total between my two migraine groups on Facebook, we have tremendously increased our sodium intake. Most of us take about between 5,000 to 8,000 milligrams sodium a day, which is nearly 4 times USDA.
Yes.
And our blood pressure hasn't increased. So it really, the USDAs are really negatively affecting most people.
And that's, that works out to about how many sort of teaspoons per day?
Okay, so if 2,300 milligrams sodium is 1 teaspoon, 2,400 officially is 1 teaspoon. So we're talking in the migraine groups, migraineurs will take 3 teaspoons minimum, typically, or more, 3 to 4 teaspoons of salt. And the general population, I'm sorry.
You add it to your food and then take it in addition to that if needed?
Take it in addition to that. So we balance the food such that the sodium and potassium are about 1 to 1. So the potassium comes into picture here as well. Because if we take a lot of sodium and we're not eating a potassium-rich diet, then we have the trouble of, again, as we said earlier, we're kicking out of balance, and the kidneys are going to remove the extra sodium and water, and we are dehydrating. And that's not good. But if we eat additional potassium, and we need to talk about this too, because I don't support taking supplemental potassium at all.
I don't either.
There you go. So it doesn't enter the same electrolyte cycle when you take it as a supplement. It hits you all at once. It can cause serious heart arrhythmia and other kind of problems, and it doesn't enter your electrolyte system. So to get potassium to match with the sodium in your electrolyte, you really need to eat the food that is potassium rich, and then you add sodium to match that. That's a different story. So sodium you can take as a supplement, but potassium you can't. And so you need to eat a very high potassium food, which is of course all if you're keto, then all the natural dark greens, avocado, these things. But if you're carnivore, all of the meats are. If you're not getting them smoked or prepared, but you make them yourself, they're all very high in potassium.
Yes, I know salmon and beef especially.
Right, salmon, beef, and then if you look at some of the other ones, pork too, and chicken, I was surprised, quite high in potassium. Duck, many of the meats that we eat, they're not really listed in the USDA for their potassium content properly, so it's very difficult to evaluate. Most of the nutrients the USDA was not looking at, so we can't really look at them too well. Like yesterday, I was looking for the zinc value of smoked oysters. I couldn't find it anywhere. So I just went to Google Dictionary, and there you go, I found it. But otherwise, it's very difficult to discover it. But yes, they're eating a very potassium-rich diet. So it's very easy to meet the requirement if you're eating properly. But you mentioned something earlier that caught my attention, which was the carnivores not eating sodium. And I have a friend, everybody knows, Amber O'Hearn, who is the key carnivore figure in the field, and she and I had an email exchange and talk, and it seems that what the idea is that, well, our ancestors didn't have salt available, and they just ate the animals, and that was plenty, and that's totally true. But those animals were different animals than what we have today. And also the entire environment was different. We had less stress, we didn't have cars, we didn't have homes or homelessness or these kind of conditions that actually need a lot more sodium, because we are stimulated a lot more in our brain than normally if we are just on the prairie field on vacation. I mean, consider yourself as a carnivore, equivalent to going to an African safari and just staying in the field, not having a cell phone, not having a television, not having cars honking at you all day long. And compare that to your modern day city life. It's not comparable. And so you require different supplies.
I did that a couple of years ago, and we did 5 days of tenting in the Serengeti, and with no internet. And the first hour of Wi-Fi that I got back was like, I mean, it was just so intense compared to, 5 days of just being in nature with wild animals with nothing. So I totally know what you're saying.
It is. And the stimulation of the brain. So we talked about the sodium potassium pump. That is basically what is happening when you're stimulated. So when you're just resting, your sodium potassium pumps in your brain and elsewhere for all your cells, but very particularly your nervous system, because you're not receiving all the stimuli. You're not activating the sodium potassium pumps as often as you would in a city life where noises are constantly coming in. And for you to even discover that there's a noise, there's a car that honked, there's a person crossing the street, there's traffic, all these things are sensory stimuli that come to your brain. For you to discover that, you actually have to use a lot more sodium and potassium. So this is the sodium potassium pump. And the reason why you actually need more sodium than you do potassium is because you evaporate more sodium. So if you go for a walk or hike or do any kind of activities, or just simply a day sitting at the computer, it really doesn't matter. If you then test if there was a chance to test what you have evaporated more. It will be, of course, water and sodium through your breathing, through your skin, through urination. Most of these will contain more sodium than potassium. So you don't lose potassium that much, you lose sodium.
Interesting. That's really fascinating. Now, when I just interviewed Dr. Paul Mason, who is a carnivore doctor as well. And so I was asking him about this because I have seen a lot of carnivores who talked about how there was one person in particular in the carnivore space that I know was adding a massive amount of salt to food, not just a taste, but like a huge amount, and was complaining about getting up multiple times in the night. And so for me, that was obvious that,
that was too much.
It was too much, right? So the body was trying to get rid of it. But when I talked to Dr. Mason, his opinion really is very much in line with everything we've talked about, but he was also saying that it's an indicator of dehydration. And I think that's the part that's hard for people to understand. Do you think you could kind of explain that a little bit better?
Sure. Well, the most important facet about hydration itself is not the water, because we have water everywhere, but that doesn't mean we're going to be hydrated from it if we just drink it. So as we talked about earlier, how the kidneys, the RAS system, clears out all the minerals if we are out of osmolality. So if you don't have enough water and we just have a lot of sodium and a lot of potassium, we can't even really excrete enough. And then we're going to really become dehydrated and also sick. But if we're out of one or the other, like this person that you talked about, oversalted the food, then there's going to be a lot more sodium. So in the process of elimination, a lot of water also eliminates. And so if you're not starting out with drinking a lot of water with the sodium that you're taking, then it's sort of a double whammy. Because if you drink a lot of water as well as a lot of salt, yes, you will urinate excess sodium and water, but it's not going to make you dehydrated per se, because your potassium stays. You're just really getting rid of your excess sodium, but you have plenty of water to excrete, because with urination, you don't just urinate salt. It has to come out with water. But if you're not drinking enough water, but drinking in a lot of salt, you're still excreting the same amount of sodium and water, but you don't have enough water. So then it is extremely dehydrating. And the same, by the way, with excess potassium. So when people are taking potassium supplement, the same way, if you're eating a lot of meat and you're not salting it, you're taking in a lot of potassium, which the RAS system will want to get rid of. So then also you're dehydrating yourself. So I'm looking at some of the faces of people that I deal with or just watch on YouTube, and I can pretty much tell whether they dehydrated or not, because if they're getting a lot of puffiness under the eye or a lot of puffiness on top of like I have a very big eyelid area, which is usually not popped up at all. I don't know, not because it's early morning, but generally speaking, it is not. But when I'm looking at people who are not properly hydrated, they usually have it a little bit puffed up and it's hanging over their eyes. And these are people who otherwise would have the kind of eyes like I do, but you clearly can tell it's a puffiness. And under the eyes, they will have a lot of puffiness, which indicates to me that the body is trying to retain water and it's putting it into different areas to sort of hold onto it. And so this puffiness is a sign of dehydration. It's a sign of inappropriate osmolality of whatever they drink, if they drink.
That's fascinating, because this is one of the other reasons I wanted to chat with you, is I work with so many people who do keto and carnivore, and so many of them, complain that if they add sodium to their food, they then retain lots of water. So the next day, like, they can't get their rings off, or they have 10 pounds up on the scale and those kinds of things. So it makes them not want to add sodium to anything, because they think that it's a bad thing to have this sort of water retention. But you're saying that that's coming because they're not drinking enough water to keep up with
sodium. So what the way this one would work, that if you're drinking enough water and the body has plenty of water, it has no reason to retain it. So when you retain water and you create edema, there's a reason for it. It's not normal. So if your body is creating its edema, it's telling you something. It's telling you that it's retaining water for some reason. And if you're retaining it, it's either retaining it because you're coming down with a bug. That's actually a very common reason why you're retaining water. Or during, for women, cycles. It could be at the premenstrual phase, or it could be at ovulation phase. In both cases, the body is preparing for something, right? So it's retaining water in order to achieve a goal, and then it's going to get rid of it. In fact, this is how we measure whether a migraine sufferer should need extra potassium or extra sodium at the time of ovulation or menstrual cycle, by having them weigh themselves and see if their weight goes up. That means they actually need potassium, more potassium, because the body is retaining more water and more salt. So they need salt and potassium, water and potassium. But if their weight drops, then they need salt and water. And so you need to take a water with all of these all the time, because if you don't, again, the body is just going to hold on to it because it needs more. All your cells need a lot of water. The cells inside our body, including the brain, as well as the rest of the body, basically the mini ocean around every cell. We have the interstitial space. This is not something that people talk about. We all know we have blood vessels, and the blood carries nutrients to the cell, but we don't understand that it doesn't actually go directly from the blood vessel to the cell. We have a little space around each cell. So if I have the cell here, then there's a room around the cell, which is quite big, which is the interstitial space. I call that the cell's refrigerator. So it's come grab something as you need it. And that space is the one that actually manipulates the electrolytes of the cell. So it has to have everything enough of. It needs to have enough sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, everything that it needs, glucose, whatever, so that it can nourish the cell and it can generate the electricity, the nutrients, the protein, whatever the cell has to do. So if we don't have enough nutrients in this liquid, and we don't have enough liquid to start with, then each cell is going to try to retain more and more and more. So we're actually inflating the cell by having it hold onto it, because it knows it doesn't have it available. It's just like if you go shopping, if you know that you're just going to go for a vacation and you're not going to be at home, you're not going to buy so much. But if you come back and you're out of everything, you're going to buy a whole lot of stuff, not just because you're going to use it right now, but maybe tomorrow and the day after. So you're going to store up valuable elements for yourself for your immediate use as you need it. So the cell does the same thing. So if you restrain it from being able to get water or salt or potassium or anything else, it's going to try to retain more of it.
That's fascinating. And I think it's just so counterintuitive that if someone wakes up and they're really retaining all this water, they're feeling puffy, like you were saying, and their fingers are swollen, then they think, well, if my body is retaining all of this water, it's because I had too much salt.
Right. And that's not true, right? It's about, they should also increase the potassium. So the balance is important.
Right.
So if you look at people, for example, OMAD, who eat only once a day, there's only so much you can eat. And so the amount of potassium from the meat or fish or whatever you eat in your OMAD, which is just really one ginormous meal, but your stomach is quite limited in its ability to hold food. And so in that case, you're not eating perhaps enough potassium, and which is no problem as long as then you don't also eat more sodium, but you still have to drink the water so that your body can flush out all the nutrients and all the toxins, because the water is really there to flush out the toxins. So if you don't drink enough water, you're not going to be able to do that. But the sodium and potassium balance, and there's several articles about that, by the way, academic articles that say that the balance is a lot more important than looking at just sodium on its own or just potassium. So if I eat a tremendous amount of salt, if I eat 4 or 5 teaspoons of salt, and there are people who do that, I just have to make sure that I also get plenty of potassium in my diet so that it's balanced and it's not going to dehydrate me. It's not going to need for me to drink more water. But in terms of water, there's a formula that anybody can use of how to calculate out how much water you need.
That was my next question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, ask my question.
No, it's perfect. It's just so great to have a formula, because, I think people are just very confused overall of like how much water they should be drinking. And it probably is individualized as well.
It is very individual, and but there are some rules. We all have the same body, right? So we all have the same functions. I mean, we may be fatter or thinner or younger or older, but basically we all have two eyes and one nose and so forth. So there might be slight differences, but the basic requirements are pretty much the same. So the formula for women and men are different because women have a lot more fat in their bodies than men do.
Yes.
So there's going to be different water need for the two. Men have a lot more water in their bodies than women do, so they will need more water. So for females, you take your weight in libras. I only know it in pounds. I have never calculated it over to kilograms, but you just have to divide everything with 2.202 or something like that to get that measure. But in pounds, so if you have your weight in pounds, say you weigh 100 pounds, then multiply that by 55%, so 0.55. So if you're 100 pounds, that will come to 55. That's how many ounces of water you need. So you divide that by 8. So that comes to, I don't know, that's what about 7 glasses or so. So that would be 7 8-ounce glasses of water. So that's, I think, 240 milliliters in European terms. So that would be 7 glasses of water that you absolutely have to have a day for females. For men, you should multiply, instead of 55%, it's 70 to 75%. So it's much more. And then your maximum is, for example, you take your weight, if it's 100 pounds, the maximum is 100 ounces. And so you need to be between these two, unless you are pregnant or exercising very heavily or are sick, then those change things.
That's funny. In my program, I have a similar, it's just formula, which is half your body weight in ounces per day.
It's very similar. Mine is 55%. It's a little bit more. I don't have any specific reason why it is 55%. I read it in many different places, but it seems that in my past 10 years of experience, so far, this worked for everyone. So, but again, I'm working with migraineurs, so maybe a little bit of a difference, but yes, between 50 and 55% for women, it's perfect. For men, it's more because they have more water in their body. If you look up in literature, you're going to see a female body is about 65% water and a man, or maybe 60. Yes. And the man is about 75% water. They have more water, so they will need more than just half their weight in water.
And same with age, right? So the older you are, you have more body fat composition, and then same with...
It depends. I think that's more typical for the modern Western era where people are not eating protein and they're losing a lot of body protein and then they're replacing it with fat. Yes. This would be a different story. But a classic old person who's not eating enough protein and is also not able to eat properly is usually very thin, very frail. So it's still, I would still retain the same amount of water, 55% for women and 75% for men, pending their activity. So the maximum would probably be reduced. But I think that the goal is as the older we get, the less we would like to lose our protein muscles, and we don't necessarily want to gain excess fat. I think that's an image that came with us with the modern era. It isn't necessarily so if you look at Aboriginals.
Yeah, in my pharmacology class, I guess they were just saying that the older you are, the body composition, body fat percentage wise, tends to be higher. In the elderly, even if they appear to be like quite thin, the body composition goes towards more fat, less muscle, and
it's probably because of the less muscle. And there's the term. I think because of that.
Not that they're necessarily more fat, but just percentage-wise from muscle and bone loss too.
And I think that is very true. But if you go back perhaps to the Aboriginal societies where the elderly don't really act elderly, they just simply are older, but they still continue the same hunting and the same way of eating. They may not necessarily have a different composition, but in our modern life, it certainly is true. I am part of this elderly population, and I'm working extremely hard to retain my and actually to gain back my muscles that the sad diet sort of kind of destroyed over the years. So it doesn't need to be that way as long as you're conscious of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm on a mission to convince my parents that they need to eat 20 to 30 grams of protein with every meal. Um,
Right.
it's more just the numbers go up, the amount you need goes up. I love Dr. Gabrielle Lyon's work on that.
Yes, follow her very seriously.
She's
And I
great.
think that the older you get, the more protein you need to consume, but also your threshold in terms of how much you can convert into muscles drops. It's a really bad spot to be. You really need to increase your ability to metabolize protein better, eat more, and also to be able to synthesize more. So you have to work out. You have to work out a lot more, and it's not an easy thing to do.
Now, for the formula for water, for people, do you have a formula for people who are non-beginners, who are just for the average person? Is there a formula or a recommendation on that? Or how can someone tell if they haven't had enough salt?
Well, it's the urination. Like you talked earlier, you said earlier that somebody was just getting up urinating. If you get up and urinate at night, getting up once as you get older, there's also, of course, a bladder incontinence and other problems which disappear, by the way, from drinking properly with salted water. But that should be the one that tells you how much water, how much sodium, and how much potassium you need. So if you are continuously uncomfortable running to the toilet all day long, I recommend to look at the color of the urine. And I know a lot of people don't like to look back to see what they left behind in the toilet bowl, but you really should look at it. And I've talked to several doctors, and there's a misinformation out there saying that you have to drink until your until your urine runs clear like water. That's wrong. That's totally wrong. So you need to urinate till it is still a light yellow color. So it is also referred to as a straw color.
Yes.
It's not really yellow unless you take a B vitamin. It's sort of kind of yellowish, but you have to have some color in there because the color represents the toxins that were washed out, whatever those may have been. If it's completely clear, it means you took it in and it just went right through you and it did absolutely nothing. So you then know that, okay, so I drank too much water because this just came out clear. So I need to cut back the next day. So you can sort of measure out how much water you will need. It is individual because many of us exercise a lot and other people don't exercise at all. And that will change how much water you will need, whether you're pregnant or not, whether you are emotionally stable or not. I mean, everything is going to change really how much water you need and how much sodium and how much potassium you need. Your urine is your best guide. So that's basically every single time you flush, you need to look what you did, and that should tell you where you stand. And if it's still colorful enough, you can just drink. Just means you make sure everything is in balance. If it's too dark, like if your morning urine is darker than during the day, that's a sign that during the night you're dehydrated and too much toxin was coming out with too little water. That's why it is darker. So if you're properly hydrated, then there should be no change. So basically, the morning first urine is going to be exactly the same color as your evening last urine. There will be no difference because you're continuously clearing out toxins and putting in new supplies, and your body is in complete balance.
I have a guide in my book that shows the different colors
of
urine, so you can look, and it's exactly what you said. Right. So that you definitely, I mean, you can look right there and just see, how you're doing. It's
exactly, and it just tells you. It's so simple, and so few people realize how important it is. And I think even fewer people look back to see what they did. They just flush and go. And colorful toilets are not very helpful. Like black toilets is very popular. They're not helpful because you can't see. And you do have to turn the light on. So.
Now, what's your opinion on people going by with salt going by taste and with water going by thirst?
Okay, so this is a very important question, and I'm glad that you asked it because I'm going to give an answer that probably a lot of people will disagree with, particularly on the thirst. But in terms of salt, I agree. If you're craving salt, have some. If you're craving because people tell you that you're addicted to salt, you can't be addicted to salt. Salt does not release dopamine and other kind of.
Doesn't high levels of sodium trigger opiates?
Not that I know of. obviously works in your brain as neurotransmitter aid because it operates the sodium potassium pump, right? So, but there are, if you look back in the animal kingdom, there are a lot of particular herbivores that don't have a chance to eat sodium all the time. They will go once a year to this. There's a video about that, or a film. They show this mountain where I think there's a sheep, wild sheep or goats that go up, and they will eat a whole year's worth of sodium, and then they just don't have any for the rest of the year. So if this is the case, I don't see how this would then make them super goats because they just ate a lot of sodium. So in terms of mechanics, it doesn't fit. Maybe as humans, because we're so deprived and everything, maybe it releases additional neurotransmitters that it normally wouldn't. I don't know what the differences would be given our society and given our changes and how we are not within our normal realm of where we should be. But if they're looking at the natural things, that would not be the case for sodium. So we don't become funky and don't release opiates as a result of sodium, unless, of course, we deprived ourselves and then now we need to have sodium. Well, yes, then there's going to be some sensation, and there will also be a reward center activation with dopamine, because we haven't had it, we should have had it, but we didn't get it, and now we got it, yay, it's a normal reaction. But if you're standard every day providing this as a common nutrient, it should not have an effect. But in terms of thirst, now we have a problem here, okay? So this is a little bit chemical here, so I try to just remain very simple. If you're eating a diet full of carbohydrates, okay, there is a manual that I refer to all the time, which is by Longo et al. It's a medical manual that is used by emergency rooms all over the United States to look up quickly certain symptoms and certain conditions when the ER doctors are tired. So you look it up very quickly. So everything is posted in order of importance. And this particular question that I'm about to address is on page 4. So it is at the very beginning of a book that is over 1,000 pages, okay? So it's extremely important. It happens all the time. So people, when you eat carbohydrates, the glucose entering the cells, it literally kicks out sodium and water. So it will make you feel thirsty, not because you don't have water in you, but because the water was removed by the sodium. So if you drink now, you will have excess water, but there's no sodium to retain it. So where is it going to go? It's going to go into extracellular space. It's going to be an edema. So already if you eat a lot of carbohydrates, you will immediately feel that the sodium and water are leaving your cells, and you will start getting edema. So people who have, even if you don't have diabetes, but you still eat the carbohydrate diet, after eating, for example, I'm just saying a stupid apple example. It's always apple because it has absolutely no nutrition, just water and sugar.
Yeah.
And so if you eat an apple, it's about 4 teaspoons of sugar in that apple. And that would be a small green apple, not even talking about these sweetened kinds, sweeter kind. So that, she said, that's 4 teaspoons of glucose that's entering your bloodstream, which is 4 times that you already have in there, or you should have in there maximum. So all this glucose entering your cells will have to replace something. So glucose requires sodium for most cells, not all cells, but for about half of the cells, we need sodium transporters. So there will be 2 sodium molecules attached to glucose to get into the cell. And so the moment the glucose goes in, the sodium just flies out, plus it squeezes out a whole lot of additional sodium and water. So there's going to be a shortage of sodium and water. So if you then feel thirsty, the worst thing you can do is drink water. So this is very much amplified in a migraineur. And so what we do actually, if you feel thirsty, you take salt, no water, just salt. And what it actually does, it brings the water back into the extracellular space, into the interstitial space, which is right around the cell, which is not inside the cell, but around it. It brings the water back in and it makes the water available to the cells, but it brings it out of the edema spots. So if you have swollen eyes, swollen fingers, if it is systemic as a result of the glucose, so there's a systemic edema and there's a localized, so it's 2 different kinds. And so if it is systemic, you actually want to increase sodium, but don't drink water with it, just take salt. And that's going to bring the water back in, and that's going to make you urinate. It's fantastic because then the water could exit the correct way. So rather than going out as an edema and ending up in your ankles or in your fingers, it actually just goes as urine. So the other thing that people could really pay attention to is after they ate carbohydrates, are they going to urinate after that? Like people drink beer and they urinate. They're not urinating because of the beer. They're urinating because of the carbohydrates in the beer. And it's the same for eating cakes or eating apple or eating anything else. So if you're thirsty and if you ate carbohydrates, don't drink. Take a little bit of salt. If you're thirsty and you're a carnivore, you're fine. Drink water. So there's going to be a difference in spectrum of who should respond to the thirst.
Yeah, I find that, because I'll have, I salt my food a lot, and I'm carnivorous, and when I'll have like tons of steak or tons of beef, and I put tons of salt on it, and then I get really thirsty, and especially for sparkling water. I don't know why, but I get so thirsty, and I could drink like 4 liters of water after. And
which is fine because it's just meat, so you're not eating carbohydrates. The only thing is that if you eat more protein than what your body can synthesize, that excess is going to turn into glucose, and it will then increase your blood glucose. So depending upon when you get that thirst and why you get that thirst. So I try to tell all my migraineurs to eat as much protein as they need. They sort of kind of have to measure out how much protein they need, which is difficult to test out because, of course, it changes by age. So we have migraine sufferers who are 2-year-olds all the way up until 95. So they're obviously going to have different needs. So a 2-year-old not eating protein at all will still be able to synthesize protein because their insulin works as a growth hormone. And so they're going to be able to synthesize some of that and make it into growth. But an older adult will not be able to do that. And so the amount of protein that you need will change. So if you're at your age, you can eat basically any amount of protein, and your body is going to be capable of synthesizing it all into muscle, or most of it anyway. And so you're only going to get as much glucose as the body allows you to have based on the glucogenic amino acids within that. But even people say, well, 60% will turn into glucose. That's not true, because many of these glucogenic amino acids are working behind the scene to convert the protein. And so they don't necessarily convert into direct glucose for your use as energy. And I don't know what the exact percentage is. It depends upon your age and how much protein you eat. But the more you eat, or the less you eat. So there is an ideal minimum. If you eat less than what would start your protein synthesis, then all of it, in fact, will turn into glucose because nothing else is happening to it. Whatever is ketogenic amino acids will move into the ketogenic space, and whatever is glucogenic will move into glucogenic. And then about half of the amino acids that are essential can be either glucose or ketones. So then in that case, all of them will also be glucogenic. And so you only have then the branch chain that will be ketogenic. If you eat too much, then you have synthesized as much as you could, and then whatever you couldn't will turn into glucose. So in the migraine group, I run a 5-hour postprandial test, similar to Kraft's blood glucose test, but instead of insulin, we measure ketones.
Oh,
and
so
they're eating a meal, and we have the fasting and the pre-meal test, and then they're looking at what happens for 5 hours after the test. I mean, they test it for every 30 minutes. And it's interesting to see, this is how we tell what the protein synthesis threshold of a person is. So if they ate too little, then they will end up with reactive hypoglycemia, and they're just going to keep on going down, 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 because there's going to be too much insulin coming up. And the ketones will also drop because you can't have ketones manufactured when your insulin is high. So we have a clear indication of that it was too little protein and they need to increase their protein. And if they eat too much, then at about the 4-hour mark is where we start seeing a huge jump in protein, telling them that they ate too much protein and they're unable to synthesize that much, and the excess is heading into glucose. So you can actually see what's happening.
That's fascinating because I've found that in my own tracking that there are a lot of times I'll have a meal and my blood glucose drop. Like most of the time it's just stays the same. Like it'll be 85 and then 85 an hour later, 85 2 hours later, 3 hours, 4 hours. It just doesn't move.
Right.
But then there's other days where it'll go down and I'm trying to figure that out. And then if it does go up, like you said, it's about 3-4 hours after. So it like stays super stable and then it'll start rising. And I'm like, why is it rising now? It's like past the postprandial peak.
And that's probably, you may have exceeded your protein synthesis threshold.
Yeah,
And
it's always after like going to a Brazilian steakhouse or something.
Right. It's, I've had that too. And this is, some people refer to it as a protein sweat. So some people sweat and become very hot because the glucose is more thermogenic when it's used as glucose as fuel. So at that time, you're probably temporarily using glucose instead of ketones. You're not out of ketosis, but you're temporarily using glucose. And so your metabolic system changes and that spikes your insulin. So that's you can see the glucose spike because your body is not ready for that much glucose suddenly that the meat is releasing or the protein is releasing. And there's why a lot of people say, well, it's not good because protein can spike your glucose, and it can. So there are some people whose blood glucose is continuously higher than it should be, even on a carnivore diet. And I think that that's just simply because they eat protein amounts that exceed their personal threshold, which is fine. It's still not the same as eating a cake, but it definitely causes a little bit of an imbalance at the time when all that glucose suddenly releases and the insulin is not ready for it.
That's why I'm not so much a proponent of the OMAD for most people because, I think humans are designed to feast and famine, but in environments of scarcity, not necessarily in environments of so much prosperity. So, it's hard to be able to regulate that. And then you overcompensate if you haven't eaten in 24 hours, as opposed to if you spread it out more, throughout the day, and then you're not overloading the system.
I totally agree. And if you look at the animal kingdom, if you look at as an example, a carnivore in the animal kingdom will not eat everything at once. They will take some part of the animal and will continue eating later on. There are some exceptions. I think it was the wolves that I was watching the other day. And when they finally make a kill, they eat until they're nearly comatose. But they're in an environment where there's no danger to them. They're at the top of the chain. They're in a Nordic environment. And so they can afford to do that, but they literally are comatose for like 2 days after that. They can barely move. And so this may not be the best way to live and protect yourself. So I don't think that humans feel in that way.
Yeah, that's a fascinating test. And I think it's really important for us to understand so much more science behind carnivore diets, especially, Dr. Gabriel Lyon talks about how 100 grams of protein that you consume is turned into about 60 grams of glucose. And so it seems by that logic that gluconeogenesis then is not just demand driven, but it is a little bit supply driven as well. So it seems like it's probably mostly demand driven, but there's a supply driven component as well. Although most of that will be taken up by your brain. But that protein is being converted into glucose in addition to being used to make, muscle and all these enzymes and, hormones and things in the body.
Yes. And so, yes, it's both supply and demand driven. And I think that the demand is sort of kind of misunderstood because if you're not eating enough protein, no matter how much your body is demanding something, it's going to do something different than if you ate too much protein. So it is a little bit more, I think, supply driven. Oops, something just fell off. It is, I think, more supply driven than demand driven, but both of them definitely participate in there. And Dr. Lyons is a very, obviously, simply trying to explain a very complex thing in a very simplified way, because her clients or patients are required to eat 30 milligrams of protein 3 times a day. Mm-hmm. So when you eat 30 milligrams of protein, grams,
30
30
grams.
grams of protein 3 times a day, you're obviously getting the proper amount for your synthesis, basically for every age. But if you're eating OMAD, as you mentioned it earlier, you could have the same 90 or 100 milligram protein eaten at once, and that's going to lead to a completely different result. So it's definitely supply driven in the sense of your demand will vary based on how much is supplied to some degree. So if I am eating 30 or less, and if it's not enough to start my protein synthesis, then literally all of it will turn into glucose, no matter what my demand is or it isn't, because I haven't met my protein synthesis threshold, and I can't do anything other than glucose from the protein. But if I ate the same thing all in one meal, then I will exceed my protein threshold. And so now it becomes more demand driven, because now I already met what my body demanded, right? So I actually had the demand sacrifice, and then whatever is left over is fine, whatever, it's going to turn into glucose. So there's a happy area in there that people have to meet that I don't think is clearly understood, that you have to have a bolus amount. And this is what Dr. Lyons presses all the time, the term bolus. You need to eat enough protein in one meal. So you sit down, you have to eat a minimum 30 grams of protein to start synthesis. And then if you're older, it may actually be a lot more than that. So for example, for my age, it seems to be more than that. I need more than two, I think she recommends 2.6 gram leucine, which is the actual starter of the protein synthesis. But as you get older, that increases. And so for my age, I'm in my late 60s. So at my age, it would be probably around 3.5 or so. So it increases a little bit. And of course, if I weight lift and I do hike and all kinds of other things. So if I eat after that, my leucine threshold will probably drop. So I will probably get away with eating less protein because of the activity. So that also modifies a lot of things. So it's not clear what drives what, but there's definitely both demand as well as supply to the protein use.
It really makes sense why in the protein overfeeding studies that there were never any negative consequences from the protein overfeeding then, because you're always, as you were saying, you're always at least meeting the synthesis requirement, right, as opposed to not meeting it enough.
Exactly. And so it's very difficult to calculate that out. So it's really a trial by error kind of a thing. You have to see, and this is when the blood testing comes in really handy. So you really need to sit down for a good 5 hours after your postprandial and see what happens to what you did, what you ate, and see what it turns into.
So if you eat the right amount at that meal for yourself, then generally your blood sugar will just stay very much.
It's pretty stable, right? So you may find a spike here and there, but the spike is going to be slow. So many of my migrants, actually most of my migrants have some form of metabolic disease. It may just be just this very mild insulin resistance, but it's definitely there because we are all glucose sensitive. And so if they're not eating glucose anymore, if they switch to carnivore, which is what I do with all of them but I can discover that they have some insulin resistance, then depending on the age of the person and depending how long they were treated with various medications, I can see how fast the body switches over to normalize things. So at the very beginning, the jump between the minimum and the maximum would be 30, 40 points. And some of them will start off very low, like in the 70s in the morning, and then they will jump to 120 during the day and then go back into the 70s really quickly after eating, independent of what they ate. So they will have an automatic insulin system that will kick in from eating meat because the body is so used to eating at that time, for example, and it will just prepare a lot of insulin. And so then they're going to end up with a sugar crash and so forth, even though they ate no sugar whatsoever. So the body is going to do whatever the body is going to do. It's sort of kind of, it will change whatever you ate. But as they heal, then you can see that there may be a complete flat line, like in the case of 85, and mine is pretty stable as well. I am between 85 and 90 all the time. Yeah. But some people go like within 10 points, as long as it's within 10 points moving up and down. And once they reach the healthy state, there really won't be any spike after eating. So that's another way to look at it. If there's a spike, then the body still expected the food, and so insulin was released in advance. So it's still not at the stage where it's just releasing continuously in small amounts regularly, which is what would be the healthy. It's still spiking for something. It has an expectation. And you know how many of the doctors recommend that you eat all the time at the same time? I don't think that that's a good idea, because that is exactly how we develop this insulin release, even without eating. So I think it is probably better to sort of move the eating times around to be irregular, as it would be in nature. You eat when you cut something. You don't eat at, 5 p.m. every evening, right? So I think it's probably better to move that around, to vary a little bit, so that your insulin has no idea, your pancreas has no idea when you're getting food, and it's not going to release anything in advance. It's only going to release it as demand.
That's great. Yeah, there are days when I am hungry right when I wake up, and other days when it's not until 3 p.m. It's like,
right.
It's got to go with how your instinct.
Or you may not even eat, like yesterday or the day before yesterday. I was making dinner. I said, I'm not hungry. I'm just not going to eat. And I pulled a 24-hour fast. And even at the 24 hours, I said, should I eat? I'm not actually hungry. But I ate because I said, okay, I have to wake up and have some good interview here. So maybe I should eat something to have my brain and not have a stomach roll. But you eat when you're hungry. And I think it was Michaela Peterson who said that 36 hours, eating every 36 hours is, for example, her schedule. And I'm finding out that my schedule is about every 36 hours as well. So it's not necessarily OMAD, because in the 36, then after that, you may be eating 2 or 3 times within the next couple of hours. But then again, you may not eat for a day or a day and a half. So it seems that there is some sort of a pattern that is sort of kind of evolving by those who fast, that seems to be telling us that we should really be eating every 36 hours or so. That would be nature's way of doing it.
So back to the test for people who are listening and who want to determine, what's that protein sweet spot for them, to make sure they don't eat too little, but not, go too far above. Although I think too little is probably less beneficial than going a little bit over. But you were mentioning testing afterwards. So if it's too little, then would the postprandial peak be about 2 hours?
It was started about, I would say 1.5 hours after. You can see some irregularities, because, excuse me, the spike we would normally expect, if they have a spike, 30 minutes after the meal. Now, if you ate a lot of protein, you may not have a spike at all, because your body is still waiting to see whether to, and this is something that's not clear in my mind. I'm still searching for the answer. How does the body actually know, okay, I'm at the leucine threshold, given that you're not inhaling one giant protein piece, but it takes maybe half an hour or to an hour to eat it. So I still don't have the answer there. And I have not found the answer anywhere so far. And I'm just now reading a book, actually hoping to find the answer, which is, it's from 1910, I think, or 12, this book.
I was just looking at from Don.
Okay, so I'm just reading this book to see if this is going to give me the answer, because I don't know the answer. But it seems to me that the body somehow preserves some memory of what we're eating, and maybe the leucine is waiting in a corner. Okay, am I going to reach the threshold or not? I don't know how that works, but it seems that nothing is happening for about an hour. It seems that at that time, about an hour, if you get a reactive hypoglycemia, meaning that your blood glucose ends up lower than what it was before the meal, likely you didn't eat enough protein. It's not quite clear yet. I am much better at testing what's happening after, like 4 hours into postprandial, because then I can see whether it did convert to glucose or it did start protein synthesis. But that 4 hours, so protein synthesis starts about 4 hours after you ate, and it can go upwards of 8 hours. So 4 to 8 hours is the protein synthesis period. So a younger person will probably synthesize it much faster. So by 4 or 5 hours, you would have the answer of what happened to the protein. And an older person will probably take longer to synthesize. These are, again, guesses. these don't exist in literature, so I can't actually answer. These are just my hypothesis. So to test, if I see a change, an unexpected change in blood glucose from a person who only eats meat or seafood or eggs, these kind of things. Eggs are actually a variant we should consider, because egg whites are quick protein. So they disappear, turn into glucose within an hour, hour and a half. So that actually is a sign. So if somebody only eats eggs for breakfast, I growl at them, because it all turns into, just no matter how many, the egg white just turns into glucose, and there they went. It's not going to synthesize. But if they also ate meat or fish or organs, then we can tell better what is happening. So this blood test tells you a lot. Nothing should happen between an hour to 4 hours after you finish your meal. If there's a whole lot of variability, there's a good chance it turned into glucose. If it's flatlined, you're fine. If it starts increasing after 4 hours, you ate too much. So it's sort of kind of, the sweet spot can be tested in the 4 hour period.
I wonder if part of that, though, could it be like, if you're saying that your pancreas sort of gets used to a certain amount, so then if you eat less than that, then the insulin will be too high for that meal, so that's why it drops. But then you eat more than normal, then it doesn't make enough, or doesn't push out enough, so then
right. I think that the goal, and this is why I would change the frequency or when you eat, is that your pancreas has no expectations. You really don't want your pancreas to have any expectation. You want your pancreas to just keep on working at the level that it has always worked. In other words, eating protein should increase its activity a little bit, but not a lot. And it should definitely plan in advance. So you need to have your pancreas guessing so that it maintains a baseline level. And then it only increases once it already feels that you ate. And so this is why, for example, eating carbohydrates is really bad, because even if your pancreas is completely flatlined and it has no expectations, when you suddenly eat, it cannot immediately produce enough insulin. So your glucose will spike. But if you are on a carnivore diet, it has time, because the protein doesn't instantly convert to glucose. It takes time for, even if it's not going to be used for synthesis, it'll take some time for it to turn to glucose, like for egg whites, which is really the fastest. It takes about 1.5 to 2 hours. I usually see the glucose spike at 2 hours postprandial. And they already know. If they don't tell me what they ate, oh, you ate X, okay, go on. So it's pretty easy to tell when somebody is eating something that the body didn't expect, because if your body didn't expect it, you will have a glucose spike. If it expected it, you won't have a spike. You may end up the opposite. If you didn't eat enough glucose and there was an expectation there's more insulin, you're going to end up with a reactive hypoglycemia. So you can actually pretty much judge where you are and how much you ate.
That's absolutely fascinating. Well, I feel like I could ask you questions for the next 5 hours. I definitely would love to have you back on again in the future to talk more about this. Now, really appreciate your time coming on today and sharing so much incredible knowledge and information with us. I know that people are going to want to pick up your book. So where can people do that? And you're also working on a new book as well, right?
Yes. So the old book is very specific to migraineurs, but I'm finding that a lot of other people buy it as well, because I talk a lot about hydration and electrolytes. The current book is Pure Migraine. The book that I'm working on, and they can find it on Amazon, by the way, and it's called Fighting the Migraine Epidemic Complete Guide. So I have a previous edition, ignore that. So look for the one that is Complete Guide. It's a very big book, 700 pages, with about 100 pages of citations, academic citations.
Amazing.
Then the other book that I'm working on is a keto book, but it's not a ketogenic diet. It's ketosis, because I find, and it's also for migraineurs very specifically, but I'm sure other people can use it. It is covering the low carb high fat, the carnivore, and the ketogenic diet. And I included the low carb high fat because, while most people, generally speaking, don't fall into ketosis on the low carb high fat, but migraineurs do. It's a really fascinating experience, because I developed the low carb high fat specifically for migraine sufferers to keep them out of ketosis, because they're still on medications, and many of them are heart medications and brain, depression, antidepressants and all that have nothing to do with migraine, but they interact with ketosis, heart medications in particular. And so I'm unable to keep them out of ketosis. It's really ridiculous. We try. Last summer I ate watermelon, cherries. I even had ice cream, everything. I don't come out of ketosis. No matter what I do, I have not been able to come out of ketosis. Within an hour and a half, I'm back into using ketones. It's ridiculous. I had to include the low carb high fat as well in that book. So that one is nearly at a stage where I'm saying, okay, now I'm chopping out sections. It's about twice as big as what it should be. So I'm chopping out, and then it's going to go through edit. And all of my books are self-published because the publishers just increased price tremendously, and I want to keep the price low.
Wonderful.
And so it's available on Amazon.com. So I self-publish on Amazon. I've always done that. I have some academic books that publish with publishers, and they sell like over $100. Forget that. So my books sell for as little as possible on Amazon.com. Paperback in certain countries, not everywhere that Amazon provides paperbacks, but ebook is available everywhere. Now, paperback is also available in other stores and libraries and universities. It's made available to them, and many of them do buy. And the ebook is only through Amazon. And that is what I recommend, actually. It's the cheapest. And the Kindle software app comes for every device that they can use. And it's fantastic. They can highlight, and I can see there what they highlighted.
How fun.
I can see not who highlighted and what, but how many people highlighted a sentence. And I can see that was an important one. So then when I do an update, I can see what they said.
Never knew you could do that. My book's on Kindle too. I never knew you could do that.
You can do that. And actually, if a lot of people highlight a sentence, then it should show up on your Kindle that a lot of people highlighted this sentence.
Oh, I gotta check that. That's fun.
Yeah. It is a lot of fun. So then you can see if that sentence, or maybe somebody highlighted something because it was a typo, fine. Then I can see that it was a typo and I can change it. So it's Amazon primarily because it's the cheapest way to go and the fastest way to go.
Wonderful. Well, if you could put one thing on a billboard for the whole world to see, what would it say?
Okay. It would say migraine is preventable with nutrition, dummy.
That's awesome. Well, I love the work that you're doing. I've had a couple migraines when I was growing up, and I know how horrendous they can be for someone who's experiencing chronic migraines. And I know there's a lot of people out there looking for. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning into the episode today with Dr. Angela Stanton. It was absolutely mind-blowing. She shared so many insightful pieces of information that put so many puzzle pieces together for me, and I'm sure they provided some insight for you guys as well. So what an honor to have her on the show, and such a wonderful discussion. And I'm definitely going to have to invite her back on the show again in the future. So hope you guys enjoyed that episode. Hit the like button, subscribe for alerts when I put out new videos and podcasts if you're here watching on YouTube. And if you're over on iTunes, please do leave me a rating or review. It makes such a big difference for me, and I love reading your reviews. If you would like to try doing keto with me as your coach and guide, you can head over to ketogenicgirl.com, check out all the meal plan programs. They all come with my coaching and support for any questions that you have when you are trying out keto or keto carnivore or carnivore with me. I just put the pre-order link for the new carnivore plans that I have up on the website, and they'll be out late this spring. So those are great to check out too. And that's all at www.ketogenicgirl.com. Thanks for watching, guys, or thanks for listening, and have a fat-filled rest of your day.